really enjoyed watching Inside Out, but as someone that thinks about thinking quite a lot, it bugged me a bit. There is a huge debate to be had about the central idea of the films, which impacts everyone, scientists, educators, and the general population. I'm not saying don't watch the films, they are good fun, but maybe think a little deeper about the assumptions you might be making and the unsolvable mysteries it creates in everyday behaviour. Traditional assumptions in perception science lead to the idea that we perceive the world by creating a fixed copy inside our heads. But the fixed copy is created by using cues, rules, and most likelihoods to compute or calculate the copy. The calculations or computations must be performed by something, some entity. There are loads of different names for this thing, but the most common name is the central executive. The Inside Out films use this idea as the characters inside Riley's head. They represent Riley's central executive or something similar, all of them doing things without her knowing to help her behave. It is worth noting that consciousness is different. The central executive works unconsciously, so we can't control what it does, and we don't really have awareness of it either. And this central executive also relies solely on the senses of the person, the big screen in the film. All its information comes from the person's senses, nothing else. But that leads to a serious problem with this idea. If this entity is completely sealed off from the world, how can it know what is real? Let's imagine I am a central executive. I have no information. None. Nada. Nothing. Then the only information I get is from sources which are bad. The information is impoverished, poor, and I need to figure out what caused that information. If you're a little bit lost as to why this information is bad, it relates to the sixth traditional assumption in perception science. Using vision as an example, light travels in straight lines. When it goes into our eyes, the retinal image is upside down, right to left, and in 2D, not how we experience the world. So this retinal image is bad and needs fixing. Now, back as the central executive, in the case of vision, I need to work out if the information is a tree, a glass, a camera, or something else. But first, why would I assume information comes from out there? The information I'm getting is coming from sense organs inside the person. Riley, in the film's case. So why would I, as the central executive, assume the information is coming from somewhere else? This isn't questioning the existence of the world, like with solipsism, but questioning why the stimulation, the information from our sense organs, is coming from a distant source. Vision, with retinal cells, hearing with the cochlea, and other senses all have this problem. We perceive the events as being out there, not in here. This has been called the outness problem. However, if we look at the traditional assumptions often made in perception science, our third assumption assumes our senses somehow inform us about the world. Although this is breaking the second assumption a little bit, which says we start with no knowledge, the blank slate or tabula rasa, we could say we start with a little bit of knowledge. The stimulation from our senses comes from a distant source, that being the piece of information. This may help our senses somehow inform us about the world. So, as the central executive, our job is to figure out what that source is, be it a tree, a glass, camera, or something else. Using this small bending of the rules, we can carry on with our thought experiment. We, as the central executive, get a retinal image. Remember, this is upside down, left to right, and in 2D, but when we get this image, why would we, as the central executive, assume this is wrong? How do we know it needs fixing? If the retinal image is always upside down, right to left, and in 2D, why don't we think the world is like that? We only get information from the sense organs. We can't quickly check the world to see what it's actually like. There isn't an answer sheet we can use because we only have access to sense organs. So we need to get knowledge from somewhere else to tell us that this retinal image is bad and needs fixing. Just like checking your answers, there needs to be a right and wrong, a correct interpretation from the stimulation, the sense organs, then matching the current stimulation to the remembered stimulation, the remembered one, the correct one. But where do we get the remembered or correct stimulation from? Remember assumption 2, we start with no knowledge, that we've kind of already broken a bit. If we use previous correct stimulations, how did we get the first one? Berkeley suggested as long as we have a sense that doesn't need interpretation, we can use that as a first stimulation. Touch as a near sense and sight as a distant sense. The near sense of touch not facing the action as a distance problem. Touch not needing help, as there is direct contact between the person and the object, whatever it is. This relates to assumption 5, I mentioned in a previous video, but there is at least 3 problems with this idea. If we rely on touch to inform vision, how do we interpret the visual cues from things we haven't touched before? Then how do we compare stimulations from vision to touch, and vice versa? They are completely different. A bump on the skin is different from a red spot. They are just completely different. Then third, saying touch is unambiguous is questionable. A light touch on a firm object and a heavy touch on a soft object can feel very similar. But if touch can't help with vision, then there must be another solution. So, as the central executive, let's break a few more rules of perception science. If we assume we have a correct representation to work from, ignoring where it comes from and the assumptions we have broken to habit, how do we compare our current retinal image to the past one? Let's say the first phone I saw was a Nokia. It had all the buttons, a small screen at the top, and a thin rectangular shape. The current image shows no buttons, a large screen, and an almost square shape with a fold in the middle. How do we know the second image is a phone? It looks nothing like the first one. Can I still call my friend from it? We would need lots of information to help answer that. What makes something a phone? Are buttons needed? What shapes can phones be? Not to mention the functionality of turning the phone on and the display differences you may and probably will see. How do we, as the central executive, know what is important to identify what we are looking at? A Nokia or a modern flip phone? Again, if this is the first time we encounter this object, how do we gain the information? Helmholtz suggested the principle of maximum likelihood to solve these issues. Of all the previous experiences that have worked and haven't worked, imagine this like a tally. You make a tally. Each time you experience something, add a mark to the outcome. A phone could call my friend, or an apple was edible. Add a mark to the tally. Then if there is something uncertain, check the tally. It is argued that modern Bayesian modelling does a more complex version of the same thing, essentially a complex tally chart. But if we look at a simpler situation, again as the central executive looking at a retinal image of circles in a big circle, what caused the circle? One tally might say a sphere is the most likely reason for a circle. So a ball caused the circle. But if we add other context and see that there are loads of cylinders in a bowl, the most likely cause would be an upright cylinder, not a sphere. But when do we know which tally to use, the ball spheres or the cylinders? When do we need to take the entire context into account? And more importantly, if we do use the entire surroundings for context, how do we interpret them? We only know there is a bowl of cylinders because we interpreted the shapes surrounding the circle. But again, where did that interpretation come from? And again, where did that tally come from? How do we build up all of these tallies to help us interpret the world? How can we know what is most likely if we don't already know what is most likely? We would need to give ourselves, as the central executive, tons of information. Dennett calls this a loan of intelligence. The central executive needs lots of information to get started, and there doesn't seem to be a way to get some of, let alone all of, that information. But once it has the information, it can work. It is how robots work. A programmer gives the robot code to work with. However, can something give humans a loan of intelligence? God or some all-powerful entity could be a solution, but this breaks the second traditional assumption of perception science. We start with no knowledge, the blank slate or tabula rasa. Another advantage of robots is that they can get corrective feedback. If there is an issue, robots can be programmed to change once they have found the issue. The robot identifies the issue, develops its actions, and adjusts. This is down to very smart training programs. We can see it in AI doing loads of that now with ChatGPT and who knows what else. This is what is proposed by the connectionist accounts of perception, which is quite similar to Helmholtz's tally of comparing new to old stimulations. But all of these assume the central executive has access to an answer sheet. It was able to check if the representations were correct, if the code was right. But remember, it only gets bad information from sensors. So where does the correct feedback come from? And a more pressing question, if our central executive does have access to an accurate representation for comparison, why do we need to go through all of this fixing poor senses in the first place? As much as the idea of a central executive as illustrated in the Inside Out films might seem like it makes sense, when you dive a little deeper, asking questions, it actually doesn't make much sense. The central executive is being asked to infer cause from effect, rather than effect from cause. If you hit a glass with a hammer, cause, what will happen? Effect, the glass will likely break. But the central executive computations does the opposite. If you see a broken glass, effect, what caused it to break? The situation is always uncertain. There are most likely situations, a hammer caused the glass to break, but there are other possible causes. A different hammer, a rock, it was knocked on the floor. Maybe even an opera singer broke it by singing. But then, if the central executive hasn't experienced a glass or hammer before, why would it assume the hammer broke the glass? This idea, the central executive, leaves us with unsolvable problems that come from traditional assumptions in perception science, which I explore more in this video.